The building blocks of neural networks, synapses, neurons, and learning rules. Introduction. Why neurons as computing units? Imagine you want to understand how a brain thinks, but instead of real nerve cells, you use a radically simplified model of one. That's the core idea behind neural networks. We build artificial systems out of many simple computing units, which we call neurons, and connect them through weighted links, which we call synapses. This idea isn't new. Its roots go back to the 1940s and 1950s. What makes it special? Unlike a classical computer, where memory and processing are strictly separated, neural networks blend memory and computation together. Information isn't stored at a specific address, it's distributed across the connection strengths. A bit like a hologram, where every fragment still contains the whole, instead of a tape that plays back byte by byte. In this video, we'll look at the building blocks of these networks, from the single synapse through activation functions and network architectures, all the way to the mathematical tools that let us understand how much a network can actually know and how it learns. The synapse, where information is stored. Biological synapses are remarkably complex. They differ in shape, size, and chemical composition, and a single nerve cell can have thousands of such contact points. For our model, we simplify this radically. A connection from neuron J to neuron I is described by exactly one number, its weight. This weight captures how strongly neuron J influences neuron I, even if in biology it would actually be several contact points combined. The central question behind this is almost philosophical. How many bits of information can a single synapse actually store? In theory, we often work with real numbers, meaning arbitrarily fine precision. But a real physical system always has a limit. Sometimes a weight is even reduced to a single bit when we want to study what happens if storage space is extremely scarce. Importantly, these weights aren't fixed. Learning means deliberately changing these numbers so that the network eventually produces the right answer. That's precisely the fundamental difference from a classical circuit, which is wired once and for all. The neuron, activation, and the weighted sum. An artificial neuron takes in several inputs, multiplies each one by its corresponding weight, and adds everything up. We call this sum the activation. In most cases, it's simply a weighted sum of all the inputs, mathematically a dot product between the input vector and the weight vector. There's even evidence that real nerve cell dendrites are well suited to computing exactly this kind of dot product. One important detail: alongside the actual inputs, there's almost always a so-called bias, a kind of baseline setting for the neuron that acts independently of the inputs. You can picture it as a fixed input that's always equal to 1 and has its own weight. Things get more interesting when we consider not just individual inputs, but also their products. This is called a polynomial activation. It allows the neuron to also capture interactions between two inputs, not just the inputs themselves. Such quadratic activations show up again later in so-called attention or gating mechanisms. Transfer functions, turning activation into output. The raw weighted sum is only half the story. For a network to learn interesting, non-linear patterns at all, the activation gets passed through a so-called transfer function. There are several important families of these. The simplest is the linear or identity function. The output is directly equal to the activation. Networks made up only of such linear units are often underestimated, but they're far from uninteresting, even though real expressive power only emerges with nonlinearity. The threshold function, biologically speaking, a neuron's all or nothing principle, outputs only one of two possible values, depending on whether the activation is above or below a certain point. A modern, very popular relative of this is the ReLU function. It simply outputs 0 when the activation is negative, and the activation itself when it's positive. The big practical advantage: its derivative is either 0 or 1, extremely simple to compute, which significantly speeds up training in modern deep networks. Sigmoid functions like the logistic function or the hyperbolic tangent are smooth, continuous versions of the hard threshold function. They squeeze any number into a bounded range, usually between 0 and 1 or between -1 and 1, and can often be interpreted as a probability. And finally, the softmax function. It's typically used at the very end of a network when you want to turn several output values into a genuine probability distribution over multiple classes. All values are positive and sum to 1. Discrete and continuous time. In most practical applications, time is simply ignored or artificially broken up into fixed steps. A program decides when each neuron and each weight gets updated. In a real physical nervous system, though, time is continuous, and signals actually take time to propagate. There are models that take this continuity seriously. A neuron's activation is then no longer a single value, but a quantity that changes over time, similar to a voltage that slowly rises or decays, depending on the inputs from other neurons. If you discretize such a continuous model back into fixed time steps, you get back exactly the standard models we use in practice. So the continuous and discrete perspectives are really two sides of the same coin. Network architectures: feed-forward, recurrent, layered. When we connect many neurons together, we get an architecture. One key distinction: does the network contain directed cycles, connections that eventually loop back to themselves, or not? Networks without such cycles are called feed-forward architectures. Here, information always flows in a single direction, from the input neurons through any intermediate layers to the output neurons. This architecture forms the core of most classical neural networks. If the network contains at least one directed cycle, we call it a recurrent architecture. Such networks have memory in the truest sense, because information can loop around. Interestingly, you can artificially unfold a recurrent network over multiple time steps, representing it as a feed-forward network with many layers. And then there's the question of how deep a network really is. Instead of vague rules of thumb like at least 6 layers, we use a precise definition. A network with no hidden neurons we call shallow. Here, learning is relatively straightforward. As soon as at least one hidden neuron exists, we call the network deep. The reason for drawing the line here: as soon as hidden neurons are involved, the so-called credit assignment problem arises. The question of which specific weight an error in the output should actually be attributed to. Weight sharing and convolutional networks. Sometimes it's useful to force several connections in the network to use exactly the same weight. This is called weight sharing. It drastically reduces the number of freely learnable parameters. This principle is best known from convolutional networks, which were originally inspired by findings about the visual system. The same small pattern detector, for instance an edge detector, is applied at every possible position in the image, exactly like a mathematical convolution. A related concept is the so-called Siamese architecture. Two identical subnetworks, sharing exactly the same weights, process two different inputs in parallel, and a final network compares the results. Useful, for instance, for checking two fingerprints or two images for similarity. How much can a network know? Capacity. A network with a given architecture can compute very different functions depending on how its weights are set. The set of all possible functions that a network can theoretically represent is called its functional capacity. Fully describing this is usually very hard. A more practical substitute is the so-called cardinal capacity. You count how many distinct functions a given architecture can possibly take on, and then take the logarithm base 2 of that count. The result can be interpreted as the number of bits needed to uniquely identify a specific function out of that enormous set, and those are exactly the bits that ultimately have to be stored in the weights for the network to know the right function. The Bayesian way of thinking, learning as belief updating. Learning can also be understood as a statistical process. In the Bayesian framework, we don't talk about true or false, but about degrees of belief that shift as new data comes in. The central tool here is Bayes' theorem. It connects how plausible a hypothesis was to begin with how well that hypothesis explains the observed data, and produces from that an updated posterior belief. In practice, we often don't look for the full distribution over possible weights, but just the single most probable setting. This is called maximum a posteriori estimation. If we ignore the prior assumption about the weights altogether, this reduces to so-called maximum likelihood estimation, where we simply look for the weights under which the observed data would be most probable. Information theory, entropy, and the cost of surprise. In 1948, Claude Shannon asked a simple but profound question: how much information does a message actually contain, regardless of what it means content-wise? His answer was entropy. It measures how surprising an observation is on average, measured in bits. A uniformly distributed, completely unpredictable quantity has maximum entropy, while a quantity that almost always takes the same value carries barely any information. When we want to compare two probability distributions, say the true distribution of the data and a distribution our model assumes for it, we use relative entropy, also known as the Kullback-Leibler divergence. It measures the average extra cost, in bits, you pay for working with the wrong distribution instead of the correct one. And finally, mutual information. It measures how much you learn about one quantity by knowing another. An important property here is the so-called data processing inequality. No matter how clever a downstream processing step is, it can never provide more information about the original input than was already there. Learning paradigms and the general learning rule. To wrap up, a quick overview of the different flavors of learning. In supervised learning, we know the desired target answer for every input. In unsupervised learning, there's no target answer at all. The network has to discover patterns in the data on its own. In between lies semi-supervised and self-supervised learning, where the target answer can be cleverly derived from the data itself, for instance by predicting the next word in a sentence. All of these variants can be captured in a single shared formula. After every learning step, a weight is nudged by a small amount that depends on a learning rate, and a function that typically describes the interplay between the pre- and postsynaptic neuron. This small, elegant formula is essentially what drives the training of practically every modern neural network.